It began with a letter, a plain, yellowed envelope that arrived in Adam's mailbox on a dreary Tuesday morning. The handwriting on the front was shaky, almost illegible, and the address had smudges from what looked like water stains. There was no return address, only his name, Adam Rowe. He frowned as he tore it open. Inside was a single piece of parchment. Not modern paper, parchment, thick and brittle. The words on it were handwritten in dark, uneven ink. Come to Black Hollow. It's waiting for you. You must remember. Adam had never heard of Black Hollow. He didn't know anyone who would send him such a bizarre message. His mind immediately went to a prank. Maybe one of his friends thought this would be funny. But as he stared at the letter, something in the back of his mind tingled, a faint feeling of familiarity he couldn't place. The name Black Hollow felt like it should mean something, though he couldn't recall why. He tried brushing it off. This is ridiculous, he muttered, tossing the letter onto the kitchen counter. But it didn't stay there for long. All day, the words echoed in his head. Come to Black Hollow. You must remember. He even dreamed about it that night. A misty village surrounded by trees, a heavy silence, and faint whispers that he couldn't understand. By morning, Adam decided he needed answers. A quick online search for Black Hollow turned up nothing. No maps, no articles, no historical records. It was as if the place didn't exist. He called his parents, who were known to keep detailed family records. Mom, does the name Black Hollow mean anything to you? There was a pause, longer than he expected. Then his mother's voice came back, shaky. Where did you hear that name? I got a letter, Adam said, his confusion growing. It told me to go there. Adam, she whispered, her tone now fearful. Whatever you do, don't go looking for Black Hollow. That place, it's not safe. People who go there, she cut herself off. Just promise me you won't go. But why? Adam demanded, gripping the phone tighter. What's there? Why did someone send me this letter? I can't tell you, she said quickly. Please just promise me you'll stay away. Burn the letter. Forget about it. Her urgency only made Adam more determined. His mother's words weren't just caution. They were fear. A deep, old fear that made no sense to him. Why would she react so strongly to the name of a place he'd never even heard of until yesterday? Over the next few days, Adam became obsessed. The letter seemed to taunt him from its spot on the counter. Every time he tried to distract himself, his thoughts drifted back to Black Hollow. The name clung to his mind like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. One evening, as he was scrolling aimlessly online, he stumbled upon a forum for abandoned towns. On a whim, he posted about the letter and the name Black Hollow, asking if anyone had heard of it. Most replies were jokes or dismissive comments, but one message stood out. I know Black Hollow. Don't go there. It's a trap. Adam's heart raced as he read the message. He immediately replied, asking for more details, but the user never responded. Frustrated, he clicked on their profile, but it had been deleted. The forum page now displayed an error message where the thread had been. It was as if the conversation had never happened. That night, the dream came again. This time, it was more vivid. He stood at the edge of a forest, staring down a narrow path shrouded in fog. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of a village, small houses with slanted roofs, windows glowing faintly. He heard voices again, clearer now. They called his name, soft and persistent. Adam, Adam. When he woke, his chest was tight, his breath shallow. The need to find Black Hollow was no longer just curiosity, it was a compulsion. He couldn't shake the feeling that something there was waiting for him, something he needed to see. The next day, he packed a bag and set out on the road. With no location to guide him, he relied on instinct, following the strange pull in his chest. He drove through endless miles of countryside, stopping occasionally to ask locals if they'd heard of Black Hollow. Most gave him blank stares or shrugged, but one old man at a gas station froze when Adam mentioned the name. He leaned closer, his voice low. "You don't want to go looking for that place, son. People who do never come back the same." Adam pressed him for more, but the man shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. By sunset, Adam found himself on a lonely dirt road surrounded by dense trees. His GPS had stopped working hours ago, and the car radio played only static. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw it, a wooden sign by the side of the road, weathered and cracked. The words carved into it sent a chill down his spine. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Adam's car crawled forward, his headlights cutting through the dense fog. The sign he'd passed moments ago loomed in his mind. "Welcome to Black Hollow." The words felt less like a greeting and more like a warning. The road narrowed, winding deeper into the woods. The trees pressed in on either side, their twisted branches clawing at the air above. Adam gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Then, he saw it. Through the fog, faint lights flickered in the distance. Houses, small, worn-down structures with slanted roofs, lined a cobblestone path. The village seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if the fog had been hiding it all along. He parked his car at the edge of the village and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. The silence was deafening. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own footsteps crunching against the damp ground. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" No answer. The windows of the houses glowed faintly, but he couldn't see anyone inside. As he walked further into the village, he noticed something strange. Every house looked lived in. Doors were slightly ajar, chairs sat on porches, and curtains hung in the windows. But there were no people. A shiver ran down his spine. It was as if the entire village had been frozen in time. He approached one of the houses, its door creaking open as he stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and damp wood. The living room was eerily pristine, as though its occupants had just stepped out. A cup of tea sat on the table, its contents long evaporated, leaving only a faint ring of residue. What happened here? Adam whispered to himself. A faint sound made him freeze. It was coming from upstairs, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like someone rocking in a chair. He hesitated but forced himself to climb the narrow staircase. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at him from the walls. At the top of the stairs, he found a bedroom. The creaking sound grew louder as he approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open. The room was empty. The rocking chair in the corner moved slowly back and forth, as if propelled by an unseen force. Adam stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. This can't be real," he muttered, stepping back. As soon as he turned, the chair stopped. He bolted down the stairs and out of the house, his mind racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But before he could reach his car, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Adam." He spun around, his eyes darting through the fog. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a chill through his body. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty streets. No answer. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He whipped around, but no one was there. His breathing quickened, his pulse hammering in his ears. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the uneven cobblestone, and he fell hard onto the ground. As he scrambled to his feet, a figure emerged from the fog. It was a woman, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, tattered at the edges, and her bare feet made no sound as she approached. "Who are you?" Adam demanded, backing away. The woman tilted her head, her hair parting just enough to reveal pale, empty eyes. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Before he could respond, she disappeared into the fog, leaving only the faint echo of her words behind. Adam staggered back to his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He wanted to leave, to drive away and never look back, but something stopped him. That same pull he felt before, the compulsion to stay, to understand, rooted him to the spot. He looked back at the village, its faint lights glowing like distant stars. Whatever secrets Black Hollow held, he couldn't leave without uncovering them. As he stood there, torn between fear and curiosity, the fog seemed to close in around him, as if the village itself was pulling him deeper into its grasp. "Don't turn away now," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "If you're watching this right now, what would you do? Would you keep going, or would you turn back? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you're as hooked on this mystery as I am. Stay with me as I uncover what lies ahead in Black Hollow. It's only just beginning." Adam stood frozen at the edge of the village, his car a few feet behind him, but it might as well have been miles away. The fog grew thicker, swirling around his feet like it had a life of its own. The silence pressed against his ears, and for the first time, he felt truly alone. "I need to leave," he whispered, though the words sounded hollow. Yet, despite his own advice, his feet moved forward. He didn't know why. Every logical thought screamed at him to get back in his car and drive until Black Hollow was nothing but a bad memory. But something deeper, something primal, pulled him further in. The cobblestone path beneath him seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, like the ground was alive. He glanced at the houses on either side. Their windows stared back at him, dark and uninviting. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, louder than they should have been. He noticed a small well in the center of the village square, its stones worn smooth with age. An iron bucket hung on a frayed rope, swaying slightly despite the still air. As he approached the well, a faint noise reached his ears, a soft hum, like someone singing a lullaby far, far away. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking slightly. The humming stopped. Adam hesitated before peering into the well. It was deeper than he expected, its walls slick with moss. The darkness at the bottom was impenetrable, but he swore he saw movement, something shifting in the shadows. A sudden noise behind him made him spin around. A door had slammed shut, though no wind had blown. One of the houses, a crooked structure with peeling paint and broken shutters, now had its door ajar. His pulse quickened as he approached the house. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound cutting through the eerie stillness. The air inside was colder, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. "Is anyone here?" he asked, stepping inside. The house was similar to the one he'd entered before, but this time, something felt different. The furniture was overturned, and long scratches marred the wooden floor. A shattered mirror hung crookedly on the wall, its jagged edges reflecting distorted fragments of the room. Adam's breath caught when he noticed something scrawled across the walls in what looked like ash or soot. "It's not what it seems." He stared at the words, their meaning sinking in like a stone in his stomach. "What isn't?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. As he turned to leave, he froze. A figure stood in the doorway. It was the same woman he'd seen earlier, her empty eyes staring directly at him. "You need to remember," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Remember what?" Adam demanded, his fear giving way to frustration. But she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, gesturing toward the village square. Adam hesitated before following her outside. The fog seemed to thicken as they walked, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the square, the woman stopped and turned to face him. Her features were clearer now, gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken like she hadn't slept in years. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone accusatory. "I don't know," Adam admitted. "I got a letter. It told me to come here." Her expression darkened. The letter. Of course. She paused, her gaze piercing. "Do you even know what this place is?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "No one will tell me anything." "What is Black Hollow?" "This village," she said slowly, "exists outside of time. It was forgotten long ago, for good reason. Those who come here are drawn by the past, by what they've lost." Adam frowned, confusion knitting his brow. "What I've lost? What does that mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the well. "The answers are there, but be warned. Once you look into the darkness, it looks back." Before he could respond, she vanished into the fog. Adam stared at the well, her warning echoing in his mind. Every instinct told him to turn around and leave, but the compulsion was stronger. He approached the well, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would burst. Peering over the edge, he saw nothing but blackness. He leaned closer, his breath shallow, until the hum began again, this time louder, more insistent. Suddenly, something shot up from the depths of the well, a rush of air, cold and sharp, carrying whispers he couldn't understand. He stumbled back, his ears ringing as the whispers grew louder, filling his head with fragmented words and haunting laughter. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice drowned out by the noise. Then, as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The well was silent once more, but Adam was left trembling, his mind reeling. He had seen something in the darkness, brief but unmistakable. A face. His own. Adam stumbled away from the well, his mind racing. That face, it couldn't have been his. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the light or his overactive imagination. But deep down, he knew what he'd seen. The village felt different now. The fog seemed denser, pressing against his skin like a damp shroud. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. He glanced around, his eyes darting to the shadowy corners where the houses loomed like silent sentinels. "Why am I here?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. The words of the woman echoed in his mind. "You need to remember." But remember what? His memories felt intact, his childhood, his family, his life before he arrived here. Yet, there was a nagging sense that something was missing, something crucial that had been buried deep within him. The sound of a bell cut through the silence, low and resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Adam spun around, searching for its source, but the village was empty. The bell tolled again, and this time, it carried with it a faint voice. Adam. His blood turned cold. The voice was familiar. Not the eerie whispers he'd heard before, but something warmer, softer. It sounded like his sister, Emily. "Emily," he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, but the voice called his name again, this time from the direction of a narrow alley. Against his better judgment, he followed it, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. The alley opened into a courtyard surrounded by dilapidated houses. In the center of the courtyard stood a figure. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. She was facing away from him, her long brown hair falling over her shoulders. "Emily," Adam cried, running toward her. She didn't move. As he got closer, he realized something was wrong. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, and the air around her seemed to shimmer. When he was just a few feet away, she turned to face him. Adam stopped dead in his tracks. It wasn't Emily. The face was hers, but the eyes were wrong. They were empty, black voids that seemed to pull him in, endless and hungry. "Why didn't you save me, Adam?" the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of his sister's. Adam staggered backward, his mind reeling. What? What are you talking about? I didn't. You forgot me, it said, stepping closer. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. You left me behind. I don't understand. Adam shouted, his voice cracking. The figure reached out, its hand inches from his face. Remember, it whispered, its voice now a mix of Emily's and something darker, more guttural. Adam fell to the ground, his vision blurring as memories he didn't recognize flooded his mind. A car crash, screaming, Emily's face pale and lifeless. No, he cried, clutching his head. The memories felt foreign yet familiar, as if they belonged to someone else but were forced into his mind. When he looked up, the figure was gone. The courtyard was empty, the air still. Adam stumbled to his feet, his body trembling. His heart ached, not just from fear, but from a deep, overwhelming guilt he couldn't explain. As he staggered back toward the village square, he noticed something new. A large, crumbling church stood at the edge of the village, its bell tower looming over the rooftops. The sound of the bell seemed to come from there, though the building hadn't been visible before. Adam's legs finally moved, though each step toward the church felt heavier than the last. The doorway yawned before him, a dark void that seemed to swallow all light. His heart thundered in his chest as he pushed the heavy wooden door open, its creak echoing like a scream in the still air. Inside, the church was silent. Rows of pews stretched into the shadows, their wood warped and splintered with age. The faint smell of decay lingered, mixing with the scent of damp stone. Moonlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns on the floor. Hello? Adam called, his voice trembling. His words faded into the darkness, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He took a cautious step forward, his shoes scraping against the uneven floor. The church seemed abandoned, yet it felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching him. As he moved deeper inside, his eyes fell on the altar at the front of the church. It was covered in a tattered cloth, its surface littered with melted candles and strange symbols carved into the wood. Behind the altar, a large painting hung on the wall. The image was faded, but Adam could make out the figure of a man standing in a field, surrounded by shadowy shapes. The man's face was oddly familiar, though Adam couldn't place where he'd seen it before. A sudden sound made him whip around. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was close, too close. Who's there? He demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The whisper came again, this time louder. It wasn't a single voice but many, overlapping and murmuring words he couldn't understand. Adam's pulse quickened as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The whispers grew louder, rising to a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the air. Stop, he shouted, covering his ears. The whispers ceased instantly, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence. Adam lowered his hands, his breathing shallow. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the back of the church, shrouded in shadow. Who are you? Adam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if studying him. I just want answers, Adam said, taking a hesitant step forward. Why am I here? What is this place? The figure stepped into the faint light. It was an old man, his face gaunt and weathered. His eyes, however, burned with an intensity that sent chills down Adam's spine. You came looking for the truth, the man said, his voice deep and resonant. But the truth has a price. What truth? Adam asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Everyone keeps telling me to remember, but I don't know what I'm supposed to remember. The man gestured toward the painting behind the altar. Look closer, he said. Adam hesitated but approached the painting. As he studied it, details he hadn't noticed before came into focus. The shadowy shapes surrounding the man weren't just random. They were people. Their faces were twisted in anguish, their hands reaching out toward the figure in the center. And the man? Adam's breath caught in his throat. The man in the painting was him. "This can't be," he whispered, stumbling backward. The old man's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. "This village is a reflection," he said. "A place where the past and the forgotten collide. It exists outside of time, drawing those who have unfinished business with their own memories." Adam shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't understand. Why me?" "Because you've buried the truth," the man replied. "And until you face it, you cannot leave this place." "What truth?" Adam demanded, his voice cracking. "What am I supposed to face?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows. "Wait," Adam shouted, but the man was gone. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. The candles on the altar flickered, their flames dancing wildly as the air grew colder. Adam turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. He burst through the door and stumbled into the fog, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The village felt even more oppressive now. The houses loomed like specters, their windows dark and uninviting. The cobblestone path beneath his feet seemed to twist and shift, leading him deeper into the unknown. The door to the church was ajar, revealing darkness beyond. "This is it," Adam muttered, his voice shaking. "This is where I'll find answers." But his legs refused to move. The fear was too great, the pull of the unknown too overwhelming. He stood frozen, staring at the dark doorway, his mind a storm of confusion and dread. If you've made it this far, what do you think Adam should do? Should he go into the church and uncover the truth, or is it time to turn back? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this video if you're as captivated by this mystery as I am. Stay with me. There's so much more to uncover. Adam's legs finally moved, though each step toward the church felt heavier than the last. The doorway yawned before him, a dark void that seemed to swallow all light. His heart thundered in his chest as he pushed the heavy wooden door open, its creak echoing like a scream in the still air. Inside, the church was silent. Rows of pews stretched into the shadows, their wood warped and splintered with age. The faint smell of decay lingered, mixing with the scent of damp stone. Moonlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns on the floor. "Hello?" Adam called, his voice trembling. His words faded into the darkness, swallowed by the oppressive silence. He took a cautious step forward, his shoes scraping against the uneven floor. The church seemed abandoned, yet it felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching him. As he moved deeper inside, his eyes fell on the altar at the front of the church. It was covered in a tattered cloth, its surface littered with melted candles and strange symbols carved into the wood. Behind the altar, a large painting hung on the wall. The image was faded, but Adam could make out the figure of a man standing in a field, surrounded by shadowy shapes. The man's face was oddly familiar, though Adam couldn't place where he'd seen it before. A sudden sound made him whip around. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was close, too close. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The whisper came again, this time louder. It wasn't a single voice but many, overlapping and murmuring words he couldn't understand. Adam's pulse quickened as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The whispers grew louder, rising to a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the air. "Stop!" he shouted, covering his ears. The whispers ceased instantly, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence. Adam lowered his hands, his breathing shallow. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the back of the church, shrouded in shadow. "Who are you?" Adam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if studying him. "I just want answers," Adam said, taking a hesitant step forward. "Why am I here? What is this place?" The figure stepped into the faint light. It was an old man, his face gaunt and weathered. His eyes, however, burned with an intensity that sent chills down Adam's spine. "You came looking for the truth," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. "But the truth has a price." "What truth?" Adam asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Everyone keeps telling me to remember, but I don't know what I'm supposed to remember." The man gestured toward the painting behind the altar. "Look closer," he said. Adam hesitated but approached the painting. As he studied it, details he hadn't noticed before came into focus. The shadowy shapes surrounding the man weren't just random, they were people. Their faces were twisted in anguish, their hands reaching out toward the figure in the center. And the man. Adam's breath caught in his throat. The man in the painting was him. "This can't be," he whispered, stumbling backward. The old man's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. "This village is a reflection," he said. "A place where the past and the forgotten collide. It exists outside of time, drawing those who have unfinished business with their own memories." Adam shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't understand. Why me?" "Because you've buried the truth," the man replied. "And until you face it, you cannot leave this place." "What truth?" Adam demanded, his voice cracking. "What am I supposed to face?" The old man didn't answer. Instead, he began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows. "Wait," Adam shouted, but the man was gone. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. The candles on the altar flickered, their flames dancing wildly as the air grew colder. Adam turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. He burst through the door and stumbled into the fog, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The village felt even more oppressive now. The houses loomed like specters, their windows dark and uninviting. The cobblestone path beneath his feet seemed to twist and shift, leading him deeper into the unknown. As he wandered aimlessly, the whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. They formed words now, fragmented and haunting. "Remember, face it, no escape." Adam fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. The whispers were deafening, their weight crushing his thoughts. "I can't do this," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what you want from me." The fog around him seemed to shift, revealing a path he hadn't seen before. At the end of the path stood a single figure, a child. Adam wiped his eyes and stood, his legs trembling as he took a step toward the figure. "Emily?" he called, his voice breaking. The child turned, her face pale and expressionless. It was Emily, but younger, no older than 8 or 9. She raised her hand and pointed toward the village square. Adam followed her gaze, his heart pounding. He knew, deep down, that whatever awaited him there would change everything. If you've been following this story, what do you think Adam will find in the village square? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to uncover the chilling secrets of Black Hollow. Stay tuned, this story is far from over. Adam's footsteps felt heavier with every step as he followed the path toward the village square. The fog clung to him like a second skin, cold and unrelenting. Emily's figure had vanished again, dissolving into the mist as though she'd never been there. But her message was clear. The square held the answers he sought, or the horrors he dreaded. When he reached the square, it was eerily empty. The well stood in the center, as it had before, but the air around it felt different now, alive with an unseen energy. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a profound, unnatural silence. Adam circled the well cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. The village felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the ground beneath him began to tremble. A low, guttural noise rose from the depths of the well, growing louder until it felt like the earth itself was groaning in pain. Adam stumbled back as the noise reached a deafening pitch. Suddenly, the well erupted with a burst of icy wind, sending him sprawling to the ground. When he looked up, he saw figures emerging from the shadows, dozens of them. They were people, or at least they had been. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow voids. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their heads tilting unnervingly as they stared at him. "Who are you?" Adam asked, his voice shaking. One of the figures stepped forward. It was the old man from the church, his face twisted into an expression of sorrow. "We are the forgotten," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The ones who were left behind." "Left behind where?" Adam demanded, his heart racing. "In the moments that time erased," the old man replied. "You are one of us, Adam. You just don't remember." Adam shook his head, backing away. "No, that's not true. I don't belong here. I came here because of a letter." The figures closed in, their empty eyes staring through him. "You were always meant to come here," the old man said. "This is where your truth lies. The letter was only the beginning." "What truth?" Adam shouted, his frustration boiling over. "What am I supposed to remember?" The old man pointed to the well. "Look inside," he said. Adam's legs felt like lead as he approached the well. The wind around it swirled violently, carrying faint whispers that seemed to call his name. When he peered over the edge, the darkness at the bottom seemed to ripple like water. As he stared into the void, memories began to flood his mind. Memories he didn't recognize but couldn't deny. A rainy night. A car skidding out of control. Emily's terrified scream. The crash. Adam gasped, stumbling back from the well. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's not real. That didn't happen." "It did," the old man said. "You've spent your life running from it, burying it. But the past doesn't disappear, Adam. It waits. And now, it's time to face it." The other figures began to chant softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody. The words were unfamiliar, but their meaning seeped into Adam's mind. Remember. Accept. Release. Adam fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the memories overwhelmed him. He saw the crash again, this time clearer, sharper. He had been driving. The rain had been relentless, the road slick. Emily had begged him to slow down, but he hadn't listened. The car had spun out, slamming into a tree. He remembered crawling out of the wreckage, his body aching, his vision blurry. And then he had seen her, Emily, slumped in the passenger seat, her lifeless eyes staring back at him. "I killed her," Adam whispered, tears streaming down his face. The old man knelt beside him, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. "It was an accident," he said gently, "but you couldn't accept it. You buried the memory, locked it away, and in doing so, you locked yourself here." Adam looked up at the man, his vision blurred by tears. "What do I do?" "Forgive yourself," the man said. "Release the guilt. Only then can you leave this place." Adam took a deep, shuddering breath. The weight of the memories pressed down on him, but for the first time, he didn't push them away. He let himself feel the pain, the sorrow, and the guilt he had carried for so long. "I'm sorry, Emily," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." As the words left his lips, the village seemed to exhale. The fog began to lift, the oppressive stillness giving way to a gentle breeze. The figures around him began to fade, their hollow eyes softening as they disappeared into the light. Adam stood, his body trembling but lighter than it had been in years. The well was silent now, its darkness no longer threatening. If you've been following this story, how do you think Adam's journey will end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this video if you're as invested in this mystery as I am. There's more to uncover, so stay with me. We're almost there. The air felt different now. The oppressive weight that had surrounded the village began to ease, replaced by a subtle, almost soothing calm. Adam stood in the middle of the square, his heart still pounding from the encounter. The fog that had choked every corner of Black Hollow started to dissipate, revealing more of the village than he had seen before. He looked around, expecting the eerie silence to return, but instead, he heard faint sounds. Birds chirping in the distance, the rustling of leaves, and the gentle murmur of a stream. It was as if the village was coming back to life, piece by piece. Adam's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move. He needed to know if this was the end, if the truth he had faced was enough to free him from this place. As he walked, the village shifted subtly. The broken windows of the houses seemed to mend themselves, their shattered glass reforming into clean, unblemished panes. The cobblestone path beneath his feet smoothed, erasing the cracks that had made it uneven. But something still felt unfinished. Adam's gaze was drawn back to the church. The building now stood tall and pristine, its bell tower shining in the pale sunlight that pierced through the thinning fog. The door, which had been ajar before, was now closed, but Adam felt a pull toward it, a final invitation, or perhaps a challenge. He hesitated at the foot of the steps, his hand hovering over the handle. Part of him wanted to leave, to walk away now that the village seemed to be letting him go. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The inside of the church was transformed. The warped pews were now straight and polished, their wood gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the restored stained glass windows. The altar was no longer covered in tattered cloth and melted candles. Instead, it stood bare, its surface smooth and unmarked. At the center of the altar sat a single object, a locket. Adam's chest tightened as he approached. The locket was simple, gold and slightly worn, but he recognized it instantly. It had been Emily's, her favorite piece of jewelry, the one she never went anywhere without. His hands trembled as he reached for it, the metal cool against his fingertips. As soon as he touched it, a wave of warmth spread through his body, and a soft, familiar voice filled the air. Adam. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Emily stood before him, not as the ghostly figure he had seen earlier, but as she had been in life, bright-eyed, smiling, full of warmth. Emily, he whispered, his voice shaking. She nodded, her expression gentle. It's me. Adam's knees nearly buckled as he fell to the floor, clutching the locket tightly. I'm so sorry, he choked out. It was my fault. I should have listened to you. I should have been more careful. Stop, Emily said softly, kneeling beside him. It wasn't your fault, Adam. It was an accident. You need to let go of the guilt you've been carrying all these years. I don't know how, he admitted, tears streaming down his face. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. You've already started. By coming here, by facing the truth, you've taken the first step. Now, you just have to forgive yourself. Adam looked into her eyes, searching for the anger, the blame he had been expecting. But there was none, only love and understanding. I miss you so much, he said, his voice breaking. I miss you too, she replied, her own eyes glistening. But it's time for you to move on. You have so much life left to live, Adam. Don't waste it being stuck in the past. The church began to glow softly, the light growing brighter as Emily stood. Adam felt the warmth envelop him, a sense of peace washing over him for the first time in years. Will I see you again? He asked, his voice barely audible. Emily smiled, her form beginning to fade. I'll always be with you, Adam. In here. She placed a hand over his heart. Now go. Live your life. And with that, she was gone. Adam sat in the silence of the church, the locket still clutched in his hand. The warmth lingered, filling the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. He knew now what he had to do. As he stepped out of the church, the village was almost unrecognizable. The houses were vibrant and whole, the cobblestone streets gleamed in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the sounds of life. The path back to his car was clear, the fog completely gone. He paused at the edge of the village and looked back one last time. Black Hollow had been a prison, a place where his guilt had kept him trapped. But now, it felt like a sanctuary, a place of healing and redemption. With a deep breath, Adam got into his car and drove away, leaving the village behind. The drive away from Black Hollow was eerily quiet. Adam gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The village, with all its haunting memories and revelations, was no longer visible. The fog had lifted completely, and the road stretched before him like an unbroken thread, leading back to the world he had almost forgotten. But something felt incomplete. The locket in his pocket was warm against his leg, almost as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Adam reached down and held it tightly, the familiar weight grounding him. He could still hear Emily's voice in his head, soft and forgiving. Live your life. He wanted to. More than anything, he wanted to move forward, to leave behind the guilt that had shackled him for so long. But as the road stretched on, an uneasy feeling crept into his chest. It was subtle at first, a faint sense that he was being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The road was empty. The trees on either side stood still, their branches motionless in the calm air. "Stop it," he muttered to himself. "It's over. You're free now." But the feeling didn't go away. An hour passed, then another. The landscape changed from dense forest to rolling hills, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. Adam hadn't seen another car the entire time, and the isolation was starting to gnaw at him. Then, just as the first stars appeared in the sky, his car began to sputter. "No, no, no," Adam muttered, his heart sinking. He glanced at the fuel gauge. It was nearly full. The engine stuttered again before cutting out completely, the car rolling to a stop on the side of the road. Adam sat in silence, gripping the wheel tightly. The uneasy feeling in his chest had returned, stronger this time. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. There was no sign of life. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal. The screen displayed a single message: no service. "Of course," he muttered, shoving the phone back into his pocket. The air outside the car was unnervingly still. Adam debated staying inside, but something compelled him to step out. As soon as he opened the door, a rush of cold air hit him, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. It was the humming. Adam froze, his breath catching in his throat. The melody was soft, almost playful, but it sent a chill down his spine. He turned slowly, his eyes searching the darkness. "Hello," he called, his voice trembling. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. Adam's heart pounded as he stepped away from the car, his eyes scanning the shadows. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" Adam shouted, his voice echoing. The figure didn't move. Adam's hands clenched into fists as he forced himself to take a step closer. "I said, who's there?" The figure stepped forward, and Adam's blood ran cold. It was Emily. But something was wrong. Her eyes, which had been warm and forgiving in the church, were now dark and empty. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and her face was twisted into an expression of anguish. "You didn't save me," she said, her voice distorted and hollow. "Emily," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought You left me," she said, cutting him off. "You moved on without me." Adam shook his head, his heart pounding. "No, I didn't. The figure took another step closer, her form flickering like a faulty projection. "You forgot me," she said, her voice rising. "You let me die." The locket in Adam's hand grew hot, burning his palm. He dropped it with a cry, stumbling backward. The figure stopped, her head tilting unnaturally. "You can't leave," she said. "Not yet." Adam's chest heaved as he picked up the locket, its warmth fading. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint echo of her voice. "You can't leave." Adam collapsed at his knees, his mind racing. The village, the well, the memories. Had it all been a lie? Or was this something else, something darker? If you've been following Adam's journey, what do you think this means? Is Emily's spirit still trapped, or is something else at play? Share your theories in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you're as hooked as I am. There's more to uncover, so stay with me as we dive deeper into this mystery. Adam sat on the cold ground, his breathing ragged and shallow. The locket in his hand had grown cold, its once reassuring warmth now absent. He stared into the darkness where Emily's figure had dissolved, her haunting words still echoing in his mind. "You can't leave." Was it true? Had everything he experienced in Black Hollow been a cruel trick? He forced himself to his feet, his body trembling. The night felt heavier now, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The road ahead was shrouded in darkness, the faint glow of stars offering little comfort. "This isn't real," Adam muttered to himself. "It can't be real." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. He turned back to his car, hoping for some sense of normalcy, but as he approached, he froze. The car's windows were fogged over from the inside, and faint handprints streaked the glass. "What the?" Adam whispered, his pulse quickening. He edged closer, peering through the windshield. The interior was empty, just as he had left it, but the handprints remained, their shapes distorted and unnatural. Suddenly, the driver's side door slammed shut with a force that made him jump. The sound echoed through the still night, sending a chill down his spine. "Who's there?" he shouted, spinning around. The silence that followed was deafening. Adam backed away from the car, his hands shaking. The road ahead felt endless, an expanse of shadow and uncertainty. With no other option, he began walking, his footsteps crunching against the gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to hold him back. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers returned, carried on the wind like ghostly murmurs. "Stop it!" Adam yelled, his voice cracking. "Leave me alone." The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, surrounding him like a swarm of voices, each one speaking his name. Then, a single voice cut through the chaos. "Adam." He froze, his heart pounding. The voice was soft and familiar, but it carried a note of desperation that sent a shiver through him. "Emily," he whispered, turning toward the sound. The fog ahead parted, revealing a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was Emily again, but this time, she looked different. Her face was softer, her eyes filled with sorrow rather than anger. "Why are you doing this to me?" Adam asked, his voice trembling. "I'm not doing anything," she said, her voice barely audible. "You are." "What does that mean?" he demanded. Emily took a step closer, her gaze piercing. "You haven't let go," she said. "You're still holding on to the guilt, the pain. That's why you can't leave." Adam shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I tried. I thought I did. What else do you want me to do?" "You need to face the truth," she said. "All of it." Before he could respond, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and Adam fell to his knees, clutching his head. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice lost in the chaos. The fog enveloped him completely, and for a moment, he felt as though he was floating, weightless and disconnected from reality. When the fog cleared, he found himself back in the village square. The well stood before him, its surface still and dark. The figures he had seen earlier surrounded him once again, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The old man stepped forward, his expression somber. "It's time," he said. Adam stared at him, his mind reeling. "Time for what?" "To face what you've been running from," the old man replied. The figures began to chant softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. This was the final step. Adam approached the well, his legs trembling. He peered into the darkness, and once again, his reflection stared back at him. But this time, it wasn't just his face he saw. It was Emily's, her eyes filled with pain. "You have to forgive yourself," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. Adam closed his eyes, his heart aching. The memories of the crash played in his mind once more, vivid and unrelenting. He saw the fear in Emily's eyes, the rain pounding against the windshield, the moment of impact. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Emily." As the words left his lips, a wave of warmth washed over him. The figures surrounding him began to fade, their forms dissolving into light. The well's surface rippled, and Emily's face disappeared, replaced by a calm, empty reflection. The village around him began to change. The houses crumbled, the cobblestone streets cracked, and the fog lifted completely, revealing an endless expanse of nothingness. Adam stood alone in the void, the locket still clutched in his hand. He felt lighter, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. If you've been following this journey, do you think Adam has truly found peace? Or is there more to uncover? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The final chapter is coming. Don't miss it. Adam stood in the void, his chest rising and falling with deep, shuddering breaths. The silence around him was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed him moments ago. For the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, he felt a strange sense of peace. The locket in his hand grew warm again, a comforting heat that spread through his body. He stared at it, the simple piece of jewelry that had somehow held the key to everything. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't expect an answer, but the warmth in the locket seemed to intensify, as if responding to his call. A faint light appeared in the distance, small and flickering like a candle in the dark. Drawn to it, Adam began to walk. The void stretched endlessly around him, but the light grew brighter with each step, illuminating the path beneath his feet. As he approached, the light expanded, revealing a familiar scene, the night of the crash. He stood on the side of the rain-slicked road, watching the events unfold as though he were an outsider. The car spun out of control, the tires screeching as they lost traction. He saw himself in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly, his face twisted in panic. Emily sat beside him, her hand clutching the door handle. "Slow down," she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm. But it was too late. The car skidded off the road, slamming into a tree. The sound of the impact echoed through the void, sharp and final. Adam flinched, his chest tightening as he relived the moment. But this time, something was different. Instead of looking away, instead of running from the pain, he forced himself to watch. He saw himself crawling out of the wreckage, his movements slow and labored. He watched as he pulled Emily from the passenger seat, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. The memory version of himself broke down, cradling Emily's lifeless body as he screamed her name into the storm. "I couldn't save her," Adam whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't save her." The scene began to fade, the rain and wreckage dissolving into light. Adam stood alone once more, the locket in his hand glowing softly. "You did your best," a voice said behind him. He turned to see Emily, her figure bathed in a warm, golden light. She smiled at him, her expression gentle. "You have to stop blaming yourself," she said. "You didn't cause the crash. It was an accident, Adam. Nothing more." Adam shook his head, his voice trembling. But I should have been more careful. I should have. You loved me, Emily interrupted, stepping closer. That's all that matters. And I forgive you. Now it's time for you to forgive yourself. Adam's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, clutching the locket tightly. The weight of his guilt felt unbearable, but Emily knelt beside him, placing a hand over his heart. You're stronger than you think, she said softly, and you deserve to be happy. Adam looked up at her, his vision blurred by tears. I miss you so much, he said. I know, she replied, her own eyes glistening. But I'll always be with you, Adam. In your memories, in your heart. You don't have to carry the pain anymore. As her words sank in, the locket in his hand began to glow brighter. The warmth spread through his body, filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Goodbye, Emily, he whispered, his voice steady. Emily smiled, her form beginning to dissolve into the light. Goodbye, Adam. Live your life. The light enveloped him completely, and when it faded, he found himself back on the road, standing beside his car. The fog was gone, the sky clear and filled with stars. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of pine. Adam opened his hand, expecting to see the locket, but it was gone. He placed a hand over his heart, feeling the warmth that remained. With a deep breath, he climbed into his car and started the engine. The vehicle roared to life, and as he drove away, the weight that had once burdened him was gone. Black Hollow was behind him now, its secrets uncovered, its purpose fulfilled. Adam didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead.